You didn't lose your will. You aimed it at something too small. That's what nobody tells you. The force was always there, not missing, not broken, pointed at the wrong target, organized around the wrong ideal. And every time you pushed hard enough to feel the resistance, there was nothing on the other side worth becoming. Will without a high enough purpose doesn't build. It burns. It turns inward. It becomes the discipline that exhausts you instead of the architecture that sustains you. Napoleon Hill spent 20 years studying the minds of people who built something that lasted. The pattern wasn't talent. It wasn't intelligence. It was one capacity: to organize every faculty of the mind around a defined purpose and refuse to release it. Not push harder. Organize deeper. The people who seem unbreakable aren't fighting themselves less. They're building towards something large enough that the resistance becomes secondary to the reason to move. This video is about that force. The one that doesn't require perfect conditions. The one that changes how you spend your time, how you relate to money, how you understand what you're actually constructing with your life, and why everything that tried to stop you was never evidence against you. It was the process. The years of trying weren't wasted. They were misdirected. Routines built and abandoned. Commitments made with complete sincerity, then quietly dissolved. Not through drama, but through the slow accumulation of mornings that looked exactly like the one before. And inside that sequence, a conclusion formed. Something must be missing. Some quality of character. Some threshold of pain not yet crossed. The conclusion was wrong. Not the effort, the target. Desire and will are not the same force. Desire wants the feeling of arrival, comfort, recognition, the sense that the struggle has finally paid off. It is reactive by nature, built to move toward relief and away from resistance. Will operates on a different axis entirely. It doesn't negotiate with how you feel. It asks what you are becoming, and whether what you are becoming is worth the person it requires you to leave behind. Napoleon Hill spent 2 decades mapping the minds of people who built things that outlasted their own motivation. The pattern was never drive or talent. It was one capacity, organizing every faculty of the mind around a purpose defined clearly enough to give the will a direction. Not force against the self, architecture for it. Force depletes. Architecture compounds. Somewhere in the Arthurian tradition lives an image that has persisted for a reason. A sword submerged in dark water, not waiting, but positioned. Looking forward to an opportunity to serve with purpose. That is the condition of will in most human lives. Present in full, directed at nothing high enough to justify its depth. The question is never, how do I want more? It is, what am I willing to become? And is the ideal I am moving toward worthy of that becoming? Self-love, understood precisely, is not comfort. It is not the removal of demand. It is the refusal to aim your deepest force at targets that leave you unchanged. The decision, quiet, made without ceremony, to take your own evolution seriously enough to build towards something larger than relief. That decision is where the architecture begins. In the chapters ahead, we trace how it is built, how the organized mind sustains what motivation never could, how that same force, applied to time, behavior, and money, produces not the appearance of a life well lived, but its actual substance. First, the pattern beneath all of it. Older than your habits, deeper than any routine, and far more specific than weakness. Before we go deeper, a quick pause. If what you've heard so far has named something you've carried for a long time, leave a like and drop a comment with one word. What does your will feel like right now? Not what you want it to be. What it actually feels like today. That small act of naming is not a gesture toward the algorithm. It is the first move of an organized mind, bringing something from the interior into the visible, where it can be examined, directed, and built upon. Now, let's go further. There is a force in every human being that was never designed for small targets. Watch how a child pursues something that genuinely captures their attention, not because someone told them to, not for a reward waiting at the end, but because the thing itself demands their whole presence. No negotiation with discomfort. No internal debate about whether the effort is worth it. The will and the pursuit are the same motion. Then something shifts. Not suddenly. Gradually, through years of being redirected towards safer goals, smaller ambitions, outcomes that could be measured, approved, and contained. The force doesn't disappear. It learns to aim lower, and aiming lower feels, after enough repetition, like maturity. This is the sword beneath the water, not destroyed, repositioned, submerged not by failure, but by a slow accommodation to a life organized around what is manageable, rather than what is meaningful. Here is what makes this pattern so difficult to detect. It doesn't feel like surrender. It feels like wisdom. The language it borrows is the language of experience. I know how this ends. I've been here before. I'm being realistic. And because that language arrives with the authority of lived history, it rarely gets questioned. But realism, in this context, is often just the accumulated weight of misdirected attempts, treated as permanent evidence about permanent capacity. The modern environment accelerates this pattern with unprecedented precision. Attention has become the most contested resource on the planet, and the systems designed to capture it are not neutral. Every notification, every algorithmically curated feed, every platform engineered for maximum engagement is, at its core, a mechanism for keeping the will dispersed. A dispersed will doesn't rebel, it doesn't resist, it scrolls, and calls the scrolling a break. The cost is not visible in any single moment. It accumulates. Slowly, the capacity for sustained attention, the very faculty Hill identified as the channel through which organized will produces results, narrows. Not because the person is weak, but because the environment was designed to narrow it. Andrew Carnegie was unambiguous on this point. The man who cannot control where his attention goes cannot control what his life produces. Attention is not a passive faculty. It is the instrument through which will acts on the world. Lose the instrument, and the force has nowhere to land. What this means practically is significant. Reclaiming the will does not begin with motivation. It begins with attention, specifically with the decision to direct it deliberately rather than surrender it by default. Every moment of chosen focus, however brief, is an act of architectural recovery, a return of the sword toward the surface. The water doesn't drain all at once, but it begins to move, the moment the hand reaches down. The mind does not store experiences, it stores interpretations. This distinction matters more than most people realize. Two people can move through the same sequence of failed attempts and arrive at completely different internal architectures, because what gets encoded is not what happened, but what the mind decided it meant. Hill was precise about this mechanism. The subconscious doesn't evaluate the accuracy of a repeated thought. It responds to its frequency. Repeat an interpretation often enough, regardless of whether it is true, and the mind begins treating it as an operating condition rather than a conclusion. This is how a temporary pattern becomes a permanent identity. The person who tries, stops, and interprets the stop as evidence of fundamental incapacity doesn't just feel discouraged. They restructure. The next attempt begins from a different starting position, one already weighted toward the same outcome. Not because the capacity changed, because the architecture through which the capacity operates has been quietly rebuilt around a false premise. Duckworth identified this as one of the primary mechanisms separating those who sustain long-term effort from those who don't. It wasn't the setbacks that determined the outcome, it was the explanatory framework applied to them. Fixed explanations, this is who I am, this is what I do, produce fixed ceilings. Flexible explanations, this attempt revealed something about the architecture, not about the capacity, produce a fundamentally different relationship with difficulty. The practical implication is structural, not motivational. You cannot think your way out of an installed belief through positive self-talk. The belief operates below that level, in the automatic interpretations that precede conscious thought. What changes the architecture is not a new story about yourself. It is a new pattern of action that generates new evidence. Evidence strong enough, repeated consistently enough, to restructure the default interpretation. This is where self-love enters not as feeling, but as decision. The decision to extend to yourself the same interpretive generosity you would extend to someone whose potential you genuinely believed in. To examine a stop not as confirmation of a verdict, but as data about an architecture that can be adjusted. That shift, from verdict to data, does not require confidence. It requires only the willingness to treat your own becoming as a question still open. That willingness is not small. It is the precise fulcrum on which everything else in this video turns. Napoleon Hill interviewed over 500 people who built something that lasted. Industrialists, inventors, scientists, leaders. He was looking for a common variable. What he found wasn't what most people expect. Not intensity, not talent, not even work ethic in the conventional sense. Organization. Specifically, the capacity to direct every faculty of the mind toward one defined purpose, consistently enough that the effort became structural rather than emotional. Hill called this organized thinking, and he was unambiguous about its relationship to will. Without a clear organizing purpose, the will has nothing to direct. It doesn't rest. It disperses into distraction, into reaction, into the daily consumption of energy that produces nothing cumulative. The distinction matters practically. Motivated thinking is episodic. It surges when conditions are favorable, when the goal feels close, when the emotional reward is visible. Organized thinking is continuous. It doesn't depend on how the day started or how the last attempt ended. It operates from structure, not from feeling. Carnegie put it plainly, the man who succeeds is not the one who works hardest in the moment of inspiration. It is the one who has decided, in advance, what his mind will return to when inspiration is absent. That decision, what your attention defaults to when nothing is demanding it, is the actual architecture of will, not the dramatic moments of commitment, the ordinary ones, the Tuesday afternoons, the mornings with no particular reason to begin. Now consider what Carnegie called controlled attention, and why he treated it as the most consequential of all mental faculties. Controlled attention is not concentration by force. Force applied to attention produces rigidity, and rigid systems fracture under pressure. Controlled attention is something more sophisticated, the trained capacity to return, to notice, without judgment, that the mind has drifted toward what is urgent or comfortable, and bring it back, deliberately, to what is essential. Every return is a repetition, and repetitions, accumulated over time, do something no single act of willpower can accomplish. They restructure the default. The mind begins moving toward the chosen direction, not because it is being pushed, but because the pathway has been worn deep enough to become the path of least resistance. This is the mechanism Edison understood intuitively. 10,000 failed attempts at the light bulb were not 10,000 defeats. They were 10,000 repetitions of a mind organized around a single purpose, each one deepening the architectural channel through which the eventual solution would travel. The subconscious, Hill noted, does not respond to wishes. It responds to repeated, organized impression, the consistent signal of a will that has decided where it is going and refuses to be redirected. The practical implication is this: the quality of your life is not determined by the intensity of your best moments. It is determined by what your mind returns to in the absence of instruction. Train the return, and you train the will. Train the will, and you train the life. Controlled attention is not a discipline imposed from the outside. It is the architecture you build, from the inside out. Angela Duckworth spent years trying to predict who would succeed in high-demand environments. West Point cadets, national spelling bee competitors, first-year teachers in underfunded schools. The variable that kept emerging wasn't IQ. It wasn't social intelligence. It wasn't even confidence. It was grit, defined precisely as the combination of passion and perseverance toward a long-term goal. Not intensity in the moment, consistency across time. The distinction is critical. Intensity is available to almost everyone. It arrives with novelty, with urgency, with the emotional charge of a new beginning. Consistency is different in kind. It requires something intensity cannot provide, a purpose strong enough to remain relevant after the feeling that launched it has passed. This is where most efforts end, not at the wall, before it. At the first long, uneventful stretch where nothing dramatic is happening, no one is watching, and the gap between current reality and the intended destination feels less like progress and more like evidence that the whole endeavor was a mistake. Duckworth called this the valley of disappointment. Hill called it the point where the majority turn back, precisely when the subconscious mind is closest to delivering what the organized effort has been building toward. What carries a person through that valley is not more motivation, It is fidelity, the decision, renewed quietly and without ceremony, to remain committed to a direction even when the direction offers no immediate confirmation that it was right. But here is what the research reveals that most conversations about grit miss entirely. Fidelity is not stubbornness. It is not the refusal to adapt. It is something far more precise, the capacity to distinguish between the discomfort of genuine growth and the signal that the direction itself needs to change. Duckworth found that the grittiest people were also among the most reflective. They didn't persist blindly. They persisted purposefully, returning, recalibrating, adjusting the method while holding the direction. This is the difference between the will that compounds and the will that merely endures. Endurance is passive. It survives. Compounding is active. It builds. Every return, every recalibration, every morning the direction was chosen again without applause, deposits something into an architecture that grows more stable, more capable, and more self-sustaining with each iteration. Hill documented this in the lives of Ford, Edison, Carnegie himself, men who faced conditions that would have justified stopping, who encountered opposition, betrayal, financial collapse, public ridicule, and continued. Not because they were fearless, because their purpose had become larger than their resistance. When the ideal is high enough, when what you are building toward genuinely represents the fullest expression of who you are capable of becoming, the obstacle changes nature. It stops being a reason to stop. It becomes information, data about what the architecture still needs, feedback that the building is real enough to be tested. Kepler observed this in the entrepreneurs who outlasted every wave of disruption. They didn't experience fewer setbacks. They had developed a fundamentally different relationship with setbacks, not as verdicts, but as variables, things to be examined, adjusted, and moved through. The will that compounds is not the will that never breaks. It is the will that breaks and returns with better information than it left with. That return, practiced consistently, with self-regard rather than self-punishment, is how ordinary people build extraordinary lives, not in spite of the long road, because of it. The will that compounds doesn't stay inside one domain. It moves into relationships, into craft, into the daily decisions about how time and attention and money are spent. And it is in that last domain, money, where the architecture of will becomes most visible, most measurable, and most consistently misunderstood. Morgan Housel spent years studying why people with identical incomes arrive at completely different financial destinations. The variable wasn't investment strategy. It wasn't market timing. It wasn't access to information. It was behavior, specifically the daily decisions made between desire and direction. Housel's central observation is deceptively simple. Wealth is not what you earn. It is what you don't spend trying to prove something to people who aren't paying attention. The visible markers of financial success, the car, the address, the watch, are almost without exception the result of one transaction, converting potential autonomy into immediate approval, trading the invisible for the visible, trading the future for the present tense. This is not a financial problem. It is a will problem. The person who cannot delay gratification financially is operating from the same misaligned architecture as the person who cannot sustain effort toward a meaningful goal. In both cases, the force is real, but it has been organized around relief rather than direction, around the feeling of arrival rather than the substance of building. Consider Warren Buffett. The overwhelming majority of his wealth was accumulated after his 50th birthday, not because his returns accelerated, but because his consistency compounded. The same principle Duckworth observed in high performers, that Hill documented in the organized mind, that Kepler saw in the inquietos, applied to capital, quiet, cumulative, indifferent to short-term confirmation. Most people look at that trajectory and see patience. What they are actually seeing is architecture, a will organized around a purpose clear enough to make every small decision coherent with the larger direction. Housel identified the true value of money with precision. It is not accumulation. It is sovereignty over your own time. The capacity to wake up and allocate your hours according to what matters, not according to what is owed. That sovereignty is not purchased with a single large decision. It is built through the compounding of small ones. Each time the organized will chooses the invisible over the visible, the long-term over the immediate, the architecture over the applause. The practical implication is direct. Every unnecessary expense made to signal status is not just a financial decision. It is a withdrawal from the architecture of will. It confirms, at the behavioral level, that the opinion of others outweighs the sovereignty of your own time. Repeated often enough, it becomes a posture, and a posture, once installed, shapes every subsequent decision below the threshold of conscious awareness. The reverse is equally true. Every time the organized will chooses autonomy over approval, however small the decision, however invisible the result, it deposits something into an architecture that compounds, not just financially, in every domain where direction matters more than display. The person who builds genuine financial autonomy and the person who builds genuine inner sovereignty are running the same architecture. One measures it in time reclaimed, the other in identity constructed. Both begin with the same decision, to organize the will around something worth becoming, rather than something worth displaying. But beneath all of it, beneath the frameworks, the research, the historical examples, there is a question that none of them answer directly, not because they missed it, because it cannot be answered from the outside. The question is this: what makes a person decide, at the most fundamental level, that their own evolution is worth the cost it demands? Not someday, not when the conditions improve, not when the fear subsides or the path clears or the outcome becomes more probable. Now, as things are, with full awareness of the gap between where they stand and where they are building toward. The answer isn't discipline, it isn't strategy, it isn't even purpose in the abstract sense. It is the quality of the relationship a person has with themselves. Hill documented it in The Organized Mind. The person who builds something lasting has made a prior decision that their own becoming deserves the full direction of their faculties. Duckworth measured it in grit. The people who persist longest are those for whom abandoning the goal feels like a betrayal of something they genuinely value in themselves. Housel traced it in financial behavior. The capacity to delay gratification is, at its root, an act of self-regard. The belief that your future self deserves the resources your present self is choosing not to consume. Self-love in this context is not softness. It is not the removal of demand. It is the hardest kind of commitment, because it asks you to keep building for someone you cannot yet see. The future version of yourself that the present effort is constructing. The person who will exist on the other side of the consistency, the returns, the mornings made of nothing but choice. Most people are generous with others and ruthless with themselves, holding their own potential to a standard of immediate proof they would never apply to someone they cared about. They demand results before sustaining effort. They withdraw investment the moment the return isn't visible. They treat themselves, in other words, as a bad bet. The architecture of will reverses that. It says, I am worth a sustained investment, not because the outcome is guaranteed, but because the becoming is real, regardless of what the outcome confirms. This is why people keep moving after every obstacle, not because they are fearless, not because they are exceptional, but because somewhere in the structure of how they relate to themselves, quitting would cost more than continuing. The will doesn't push them forward, it makes retreat unacceptable. That threshold, where stopping becomes the harder option, is not a personality trait. It is something built, deliberately, through every return, every recommitment, every decision to treat your own evolution as non-negotiable. You don't find that threshold, you construct it. And everything in the next 2 blocks is about exactly how. Most approaches to willpower are built around the same flawed premise, that the path to sustained effort runs through intensified resistance. Push harder against the impulse, white-knuckle through the discomfort, prove through repeated confrontation that you are stronger than what pulls you off course. The research says otherwise. Judson Brewer, neuroscientist and behavioral change specialist, spent years mapping the mechanics of habit and self-regulation. His finding reframes the entire conversation. The brain doesn't respond to suppression. It responds to value updates. You don't override an unproductive behavior by fighting it. You replace it by making a more productive behavior genuinely more rewarding than the one it displaces. Force applied consistently against the same resistance doesn't build strength. It builds exhaustion, and exhausted systems revert. The practical implication is architectural. Instead of asking, how do I resist what pulls me away from my purpose? The more powerful question is, how do I design the conditions in which my purpose becomes the path of least resistance? This is not a shortcut. It is a more sophisticated application of the same will. Carnegie understood this at a structural level. The organized mind doesn't just define a purpose. It constructs the environment in which that purpose can be pursued with minimum friction. Because attention, energy, and time are finite. Every decision about how they are spent is either protecting the architecture or eroding it. There is no neutral ground. Every environment you inhabit is either training your will or dispersing it. Consider what this means practically. The person who leaves their phone in another room during deep work is not being disciplined. They are being architectural. They are removing a variable that would otherwise compete with their purpose for the most valuable resource they have: directed attention. The person who structures their morning before the demands of others arrive is not being rigid. They are ensuring that the organized mind gets first claim on the day's best energy. These are not productivity hacks. They are expressions of will operating at its most intelligent, not fighting the current, but redirecting the river. Kepler's most effective leaders shared one visible pattern. They were ruthless about protecting the conditions that made their best work possible. Not because they were exceptionally disciplined, but because they understood something most people miss entirely. Sustained performance is an environmental problem as much as a personal one. The will that wins is rarely the will that pushed hardest. It is the will that engineered the smartest field. Brewer's research adds one more layer that changes everything. The brain updates behavior based on perceived value, not on imposed restriction. Which means the most powerful thing you can do is not eliminate the distraction, but make the direction genuinely more rewarding than the alternative. Not through fantasy. Through the accumulated experience of what building actually feels like. The specific, embodied satisfaction of moving towards something that matters. That satisfaction is not automatic. It is cultivated, deliberately, through enough repetitions of chosen direction that the nervous system begins to associate purpose with reward and distraction with the particular emptiness it actually produces. Will expands when friction decreases, and when the direction feels worth the energy it requires. Design the field. The fight becomes smaller on its own. Every architecture has a foundation, and the foundation of will, stripped of all philosophy, all framework, all symbolic language, is one repeatable act. Beginning again. Not the grand recommitment. Not the annual resolution or the dramatic declaration made in the presence of witnesses. The quiet, unglamorous decision to return to the direction, today, after yesterday didn't hold, after the week collapsed, after the voice offered its familiar verdict and you heard it, and continued anyway. Hill was precise about this mechanism. The subconscious mind doesn't respond to intention. It responds to repetition. Every return, however small, is a deposit. Every deposit shifts the probability that the next return will require less effort than the one before. This is not metaphor. It is how neural pathways are restructured, not through insight, but through repeated action in a chosen direction. The implication is significant, and most people miss it entirely. The person who begins again 10 times is not failing 9 times. They are building the structural capacity for a 10th attempt that lands differently than all the previous ones. The attempt isn't wasted. The architecture it constructs is cumulative. What looks like repetition from the outside is construction from the inside. Each return laying down another layer of the foundation that will eventually make the direction feel inevitable rather than effortful. Duckworth found this pattern consistently across high performers. They didn't experience fewer setbacks than others. They had developed a shorter recovery time. The gap between stopping and returning, measured in hours rather than weeks, in decisions rather than feelings, was the actual variable that separated sustained progress from permanent stagnation. Recovery time is trainable, and it shortens through exactly one mechanism: practicing the return before you feel ready to make it. This is where self-love operates with the most practical precision, not as a feeling of worthiness that arrives before the action, but as the decision to act as though you are worth returning to, before the evidence confirms it. To treat the direction not as something you have earned the right to pursue, but as something you are in the process of earning, through the act of pursuit itself. Carnegie observed this in every person he studied who built something that outlasted their initial motivation. They didn't wait for confidence. They built it through the accumulated experience of showing up, returning, adjusting, and continuing. Confidence, in this framework, is not a prerequisite for action. It is a consequence of it. The will doesn't wait to feel strong before moving. It moves and discovers its strength in the motion. Ulysses didn't string the bow in one clean motion. He returned to it, again and again, adjusting, recalibrating, absorbing each failed attempt as information rather than verdict, until the arrow found its line. The feat wasn't raw strength. It was the accumulated precision of someone who refused to let the distance between attempt and result define the limit of what was possible. Every person who has ever built something meaningful has a version of that story. Not the highlight, the returns, the mornings that didn't feel like progress but were, the decisions made without applause that compounded into a life. Beginning again is not a sign that the architecture failed. It is how the architecture is built, one return at a time, one quiet decision at a time, one act of self-regard at a time, until the direction stops feeling like discipline and starts feeling like who you are. Everything we have covered points to one moment, not a technique, not a framework, not another insight to consider and file away. A decision, the kind that doesn't arrive with fanfare, that surfaces quietly in the middle of an ordinary day when the distance between who you are and who you are capable of becoming becomes impossible to keep ignoring. When the accumulated weight of every return, every deposit, every quiet Tuesday morning finally tips the scale. When the sword, submerged for years beneath misdirected effort, insufficient targets, and borrowed definitions of what a life should look like, is ready to rise. That moment is not given to you. It is built toward. Hill spent 20 years documenting what happens when a human mind organizes itself completely around a defined purpose. Not partially, completely. When every faculty, every decision, every allocation of attention and energy points in the same direction with the consistency of someone who has stopped negotiating with themselves about whether the direction is worth it. He called what emerged from that process the master mind, not intelligence, not talent. Organized will, applied without apology. Duckworth measured it in the people who outlasted every wave of difficulty, every valley of disappointment, every moment when stopping would have been the reasonable choice. What she found was not superhuman resilience. It was something far more available and far more demanding. The refusal to let the present moment define the limit of the possible. The insistence, quiet and unannounced, that the becoming is not optional. Housel watched it express itself in financial behavior, in the compounding of small, invisible decisions made by people who understood that sovereignty over their own time was worth more than any display of arrival, who chose again and again the invisible over the visible, because they knew what the invisible was building. Kepler's Inquietos lived it as a daily practice, building in the dark, planting without knowing the season of the harvest, continuing not because the path was clear, but because stopping had become structurally incompatible with who they had decided to be. Different domains, different vocabularies, one force, and here, right here, is what that force requires from you. Not someday, not when the fear subsides or the conditions improve, or the outcome feels more probable. Now, it requires you to decide, with the full weight of everything you now understand, that your own becoming is non-negotiable. Not comfortable, not convenient, non-negotiable. There is a difference between those words that changes everything. Comfortable means you proceed when the path is clear. Non-negotiable means you proceed, regardless. With full awareness that the architecture doesn't build itself, that the sword doesn't rise without a hand willing to lift it, that the person waiting on the other side of this commitment is not someone you find, but someone you construct. Carnegie documented men who had nothing, no capital, no connections, no favorable circumstances, who built things that outlasted their own lifetimes, not because circumstance permitted it, because their organized will made circumstance irrelevant. Ford didn't wait for the road to be clear. He built the road. Edison didn't wait for the solution to arrive. He became the person whose organized attention made the solution inevitable. What separated them was not genius. It was the refusal, sustained, deliberate, grounded in genuine self-regard, to let the present define the limit of the possible. You have been doing that work, longer than you know, in ways you haven't fully credited. Every return after a setback. Every morning you chose direction over comfort. Every time you refused to let the voice that calls it weakness have the final word. Every quiet decision, unseen, unapplauded, unrewarded in the short term, that deposited something into an architecture you are only now beginning to recognize for what it is. That wasn't struggle. That was construction. And what has been constructed, through every attempt you dismissed, every return you underestimated, every act of self-regard that looked like nothing from the outside, is the foundation of a will that is no longer waiting for permission. The sword is already rising. The only question left is whether you will recognize it and lift it the rest of the way. There is a certain kind of person who never makes the headlines. They don't announce their commitments. They honor them. They don't perform their discipline. They practice it, quietly, in the spaces between what the world observes. They build in the dark, compound in silence, and arrive, not suddenly, but inevitably, at a life that reflects the architecture they chose to construct. You have met this person. You may not have recognized them, because the most striking thing about them is not what they achieved. It is the quality of presence they carry, the absence of urgency that comes from knowing exactly what they are building and why. The calm that is not passivity, but sovereignty. That sovereignty is available to you, not as a destination, as a practice, not as something you arrive at, as something you choose repeatedly, in the ordinary moments that no one is watching and nothing is confirming that the choice was right. Everything in this video reduces to one operational truth. Will is not a resource you either have or lack. It is a direction you either organize or abandon. Organize it around a purpose high enough to justify the becoming it requires. And the architecture builds itself. One return at a time. One unglamorous morning at a time. One decision made without applause, compounding into a life. Hill spent 20 years documenting this. Duckworth measured it. Housel traced its expression in the financial decisions that build genuine autonomy. Kepler watched it produce the people who outlast every wave of disruption, every season of doubt, every voice that offered a compelling reason to stop. The common thread was never exceptional talent. It was the refusal, sustained, deliberate, and grounded in genuine self-regard, to treat their own evolution as optional. Here is what that means for you, specifically, practically, starting now. The targets you have been pursuing, are they high enough to justify the person they require you to become? The environment you inhabit daily, is it protecting your architecture or eroding it? The relationship you have with yourself when the effort doesn't hold, does it sound like a verdict or like a return? These are not rhetorical questions. They are the actual design parameters of a will that compounds. Your will never disappeared. It was never broken. It was waiting, as it has always waited, for a purpose worthy of its depth. For the moment you would stop measuring it against what it failed to produce, and start directing it toward what it is actually capable of building. You didn't lose your will. You aimed it at something too small. Now you know what it was always capable of. Now you know what it was always building toward. The architecture is already in motion. It has been longer than you realize. What changes today is not the force. The force was always there. What changes today is the target. If this reflection has named something you have been carrying for a long time, leave a comment with one word. What does your will feel like right now? Not what you want it to be. What it actually feels like today. That act of naming is itself a return. And every return is a deposit into the architecture you are building. Subscribe if you want to go deeper, because what we covered today is one layer of a much larger structure, and the next layer is already waiting.